Welcome to Leaders in the Arena. My name is Jenny Whitener, and I'm the CEO of Bridge Innovate. For over 20 years, we've empowered leaders to think, lead, and problem solve differently for sustainable results. This series is designed to share valuable insights and lessons from our clients, our network, and inspirational leaders in the arena who are championing organizational growth and social good. Thanks for joining us today. At Bridge Innovate, we are focused on developing new solutions through strategic planning, business innovation, and human-centered design work. We also do quite a bit of leadership development and helping organizations enable those leaders to lead through the change effort. So thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of Leaders in the Arena. We are so fired up to welcome our special guest today, Brandon Springle. He is the OD and Success Director at Shaw Industries. You'll see here he also gives a way of introducing himself with some of these attributes. And I was telling him as we were getting ready for today's program that I just love this concept where he talks about organizational strategist, curious researcher, psychological safety coach, cultural architect, signal seeker, thought partner, writer, and keynote speaker. I mean, every time I've had the pleasure of knowing Brandon now for quite some time, and every time I have a chance to engage with him, I'm learning something new. So I'm excited to welcome him today. And as we get started, for those of you who are joining us live, feel free to post questions and to chat with each other in the chat if you're participating in the webinar link, and we'll try to get to your questions at the end of today's program. So without further ado, welcome, Brandon. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the group, to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, the only other thing that I will add that's not kind of here is my family, which grounds me. So my wonderful wife, Kimmy, and my 4 energetic and amazing children that keep me very busy and definitely keep me on my toes as well.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that is part of the whole life experience, right? Family, community, professional experience. So thanks so much for bringing all of that with you today to share your perspective. You know, this concept of psychological safety has been in the forefront for us, really, I think, coming to light very heavily during the pandemic and then post-pandemic. But for those folks who are not that familiar with it, can you start us off by sort of giving us the major framework of psychological safety and grounding us in that?
Sure. So I'll talk through just a few frameworks today. The first one that I will note is the 4 stages of psychological safety, because that's the first one I really encountered. I always understood the value of creating a safe space and how we handle feedback and conversations. But this framework really put it in perspective for me as an individual. So I'll describe it just a little bit. If you look at an x-axis and a y-axis and you see permission being on the X and respect being on the Y, those are critical components to this. But if you start this process and this journey thinking about psychological safety and being new to a social setting, you don't feel included right away. So inclusion safety is the first step, and it's where you break that inclusion threshold. So you move from exclusion to inclusion because you've been accepted into the group. The second stage is learner safety. Learner safety means you are safe to learn, to ask questions, to make mistakes. So that's pretty much what that's all about. The third stage is contributor safety, and that's a stage where it's really moving into I'm able to effectively contribute, to make a difference, to make an impact. I understand, I've learned, I'm ready to apply. And that's where that performance piece starts to come into play, because you're starting to meet higher level expectations. And then the fourth stage is where you really start to see innovation. That's where you challenge the status quo for the purpose of making things better, because you understand your role and how you play into that. And you have cover from your leadership to ask tough questions to make things better. Challenger safety is a really tough stage. So that's the 4 stages framework. And I'll talk a little bit about the axes because I think it's important. So if you think about permission, I can give somebody a lot of permission, but have low respect. That's exploitation. Or I could have a ton of respect, but no permission, and I'm like a micromanager or a helicopter parent sort of situation. And that's the paternalism piece. So those are 2 dimensions. It's important to note that respect and permission and how they tie into those 4 stages.
I think this is just so insightful for people to have this foundation, Brandon, because we talk to a lot of managers who are today challenged in market conditions. They're really needing that innovation spark. They need all the capability to come from their team. And I think often they don't think about the power of bringing that psychological safety framework and that culture to bear for that team to really enable that innovation capacity, that top performance capacity. And it's, as you've laid it out today, it's a very simple process that a manager, if they keep focused on it, they can really make some things happen.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've heard the language of a psychological contract, but I want to talk a little bit about, more about the four stages and talk a little bit about that social exchange, right? So the social exchange of the first step is I'm going to accept you on the basis of your humanity. So, and you're human and you're harmless, so I accept you, right? And so if you're watching along or if you're listening in, there is a slide that should be coming up that talks about the social exchange. So the second stage really talks about I'm going to encourage you in exchange for your engagement. That's how you get the learner safety moving along. And then contributor safety, you look at I'm going to grant you autonomy and guidance in exchange for your performance and tangible results, right? And then on that fourth stage, I talked a little bit about this a second ago, but my leader lets me know, and there's a clear expectation that if I need to challenge the status quo and say, hey, I think we should do something differently, I have cover to be candid as long as I'm operating with a respectful tone and posture, right? As far as how I'm communicating. So wanted to talk a little bit through those social exchanges to really underscore the importance of those four stages.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, when it's laid out like this, it seems so simple, Brandon, but it's really not. I mean, it's clearly articulated for leaders and managers and team members to understand these aspects, but why is it so difficult for us to do this?
Yeah, it's difficult because it's not really laid out this clearly. And so I want to give a lot of kudos and credit to Dr. Timothy Clark, who is a social scientist from Oxford. And also he's a former plant manager. So he's very process focused. So his desire was to create a way to operationalize psychological safety. So I went through his training and his certification back in 2021. And that's why it's easiest for me to explain it using this framework to anybody who doesn't necessarily have the knowledge or experience with psychological safety. This framework puts it in pretty straightforward terms.
Right. We'll see a lot of leadership teams come in and talk about the fact that they don't have norms for conflict. And that to me goes down to your challenger safety,
Right.
where they'll say, like maybe somebody's very conflict open and they're constantly challenging everything. And there could be other styles in the team that really don't know how to respond to that. And so it's almost like the team, including the team leader, really need to talk about how they're going to challenge ideas and keep it around the focus of challenging ideas and not make it personal so that you can have that safety to really be the very best team and the very best performance that you achieve. How do you help that conversation go to fruition?
This is a perfect like segue, Jenny. So I want to talk a little bit about team effectiveness and high performing teams. And ultimately, the psychological safety in isolation doesn't really move that needle. We have to make sure that we understand the other factors that are critical and foundational, that then psychological safety can, accelerate those other dimensions and factors. So I want to mention Project Aristotle. I'm not sure if listeners have heard of Project Aristotle, but essentially it was a project that was done 2012 to 2014. It was a 2-year study. It was 180 teams ranging from sizes of 3 individuals on a team to 50, looking at 250 items like on a survey to really start to understand what makes up a team and how do we know a team is effective or high performing. And so what came out of that study that is reinforced by the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson, who is an icon in the psychological safety space. But what came out of that study was really 5 factors and 5 dynamics for high performing teams. So the first one being psychological safety being most important, right? Dependability being second most important, structure and clarity being third most important, meaning being fourth most important, and impact being fifth. So Jenny, I'm going to work up this list and then I'm going to walk into psychological safety. So the
Okay.
first step is really around impact. That's critical. So that means me as an individual, I understand my impact because I've co-designed with my leader and I'm connected and I see what my work will do. The second one is meaning. Work is personally important to different team members, and it's not all for the same reason. It can be because I need to pay my bills or because, I have a bigger purpose or meaning within the context of the landscape of employment. The third, once you get those first two, is structure and clarity. My role is crystal clear. I know my lane and I can sprint in my lane. I know what the plan is. I know what the goals are. We have effective meetings. Our meetings have outcomes. We're not wasting time. We're focused on performance. Then after that, we have dependability. Team members get things done on time and at a high standard, right? And that means we have an accountability system. So if somebody's not doing that, then there's a conversation that has to happen, which leads into psychological safety. Team members can challenge each other. They can ask questions. They can take risks. They can be vulnerable. They can brainstorm in front of one another. And that's how that works. But if I only were to cover psychological safety and some of these other factors were not in play, psychological safety would be very, very short term for us.
Yeah. I mean, interesting that 4 and 5, you talk about impact. Team members think that their work matters and meaning. Work is personally important and has meaning. I think oftentimes we go right for structure, clarity, like the work, right?
Right.
And we forget to take that personal step to really understand each other
Right.
and
Right.
really understand, what does work mean for you? What is the purpose? How do you get energy from the work? What's most important to you? And I think just knowing each other on a human level and your role with work creates that foundation to have those tougher conversations further up the ladder. Is that true?
I believe it's true, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation, and I think that will come up. But I think absolutely showing empathy, understanding, and then showing compassion to meet those needs foundationally. Even if we look at Maslow's hierarchy, right, it comes into play with safety and security at the foundation of that pyramid. So absolutely, it's really critical to understand and help people see their impact on the front end, and things work much better beyond that initial engagement.
Yeah, we see this concept of meaning and purpose coming into life with some of our leadership work, Brandon, where we have a values exercise that we do with teams and leaders to say, what are your personal values and what are the team's values? And really getting to know each other about what really drives you on a personal level begins to create that familiarity, starts to build a foundation of trust. I know where you're coming from. I know what's important to you, and I can be considerate of that when I'm teaming with you to make real work happen. So I see all of this coming together, right? Psychological safety, great teaming, great leadership. It really does play well together, doesn't it?
That's right. When we know, when we care, and when we respond in kind, anything is possible.
Yeah, it's that fundamentals, right? We forget that we're human and we have to fundamentally treat each other with respect, be curious with each other, bring the best out in each other.
That's
So, what
right.
else do we have for sharing with us today? What's next?
So let's see. Um, I want to make sure that I make this connection because this is very important. So I talked a little bit about the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson, and she has been researching 30 plus years. I know at least since 99 was the first really impact paper. And she is really responsible for the construct of team psychological safety. So an effective team study overlays her research very well. So the psychological safety zones are really, really important to understand. And I use this visual quite a bit. It's from her book, The Fearless Organization. And I think that book came out in 2018. But she puts on the x-axis motivation and accountability, or really that performance standard. And then on the y-axis, psychological safety. So if you have low motivation and accountability and low psychological safety, you are in the the apathy zone. Nobody wants to be in the apathy zone. That's not a good place to be. Far too often, though, we have high standards or perceived high standards, but low psychological safety. And then we find ourselves in the anxiety zone We're trying to get a lot done, but we don't have the safety. We're not asking questions. We may be shielding, we may be masking. Not a good place to be. Creates a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, right? High psychological safety and low performance standards being motivation and accountability puts us in a comfort zone. Psychological safety is not about being comfortable. It's about doing hard things when you're uncomfortable, but knowing there will be a good output because the environment is safe and supportive, which gets us to high psychological safety and high motivation and accountability being in the learning zone, which then feeds into the growth zone naturally. So the learning zone is really where you're most safe. You're freely learning, you're freely expressing, asking questions. That's the zone we really want to live in.
Mhm. Right. I mean, there's so much work in the literature today around high performing organization, that this learning zone, this growth mindset.
Yes.
There's so many things that we're uncovering in the work that we do, the competitive threats that we experience in business, that people need to be, like you're saying, you're and even in your bio, being curious,
Mhm.
right? And sort of seeking new knowledge, seeking new perspective, exploring new solutions. And that learning zone, having that, as you're saying, high motivation and high psychological safety, that's where every manager really needs their team to be, is to be in that learning zone, just seeking to do their very best.
Absolutely.
You know, there's an activity that we do sometimes with our clients. It's called powerful, powerless. And you might have done this with some of the teams that you work with when you're trying to explore some of Dr. Edmondson's work in this psychological safety. And we just have, like, if you took a piece of paper, right, and you drew a line down the middle, on one side you put powerful and the other you put powerless. And we ask people to personally reflect on experiences they've had and say, think of a time when you felt powerless. What was happening? How were you communicated with? What was going on? And think of a time when you felt powerful. And how were you engaged with others? What things were being said? What accountabilities or responsibilities were you given when you felt powerful? But just having people reflect a little bit of some of this work from Dr. Edmondson and on psychological safety, they begin to see the behaviors, right? The behaviors that are happening within the team, among the team members, or with their manager, that are really contributing to powerful or powerless type of environments. Do you agree that these things all are connected?
I think it certainly resonates. When I think about the way I learned about psychological safety, one of the key attributes is to flatten the hierarchy, right? And you feel powerful when there's not a designated person that wields all the power in the room, but you let individuals work in their genius zones based on what they can contribute and bring to the table. So you are being inclusive with your leadership style and you're empowering others to be their best. So I definitely think that's a wonderful exercise because you get to understand what's going on when you're feeling powerful versus what's going on when you feel powerless, and you do a root cause analysis, and then
Ah,
you start to make an adjustment and start to actually shift your environment by setting the expectations for yourself and what you want to do and how you want to grow and develop, and it transforms the way that we have conversations when that happens.
right, right, absolutely. I think that self-awareness
Yes.
piece becomes so important, to be reflective and self-aware. Talk a little bit about the leadership. I know that's one of the things you and I have talked about this before, that it's great to have all the learning on psychological safety. It's great to have all the models, but talk about the importance and the role of leaders in this environment.
Yeah, so when you are a leader in the arena, you really want to think about ways that you can build psychological safety in the workplace because ultimately leaders of others are responsible, but they're not responsible alone. I want to be clear about this because we all have an aspect of control around how we respect one another, the permissions we grant one another. So psychological safety is a sport that's for everybody, but leaders set the tone. So by setting the tone, you have to first role model what you expect. How do you handle failures? Do you blow a gasket? Do you yell? Do you show aggravation? How do you lead with vulnerability? Are you infallible? Do you make mistakes? How do you handle those mistakes? Role model, talk about those things in the lessons learned. The second thing is you want to make sure that you're evaluating your leadership style. Every leadership style is not appropriate for every environment. So you want to make sure you understand how you're showing up by creating the safe spaces and asking for feedback. How are things going? you know, am I doing anything that's causing you frustration? And ask those questions in earnest, but you got to model some EQ to do that effectively, which is self-awareness, self-regulation or self-management, social awareness, and then you can effectively manage your relationships looking at those four quadrants. The third thing I want to talk about is don't use language where you're blaming people, pointing fingers, or being overly negative. That doesn't help anybody. And I consider that destructive. You can give constructive feedback. And I think about constructive as construction. You want to build people up, not tear them down. And then the last thing is demonstrate that inclusion safety and include your team in decisions that are important. That then affects the impact, the meaning elements we talked about with the Project Aristotle. And it shows you to be an inclusive leader that cares about the input of the team and what they think. And that starts to build safety. If I'm just on a team and decisions are being made and I have no idea about why or how, I'm never really going to feel safe because I don't know what's coming. I have no input in it. And I feel very small in cases like that, if that were to happen, right?
Right. I mean, what for very critical capabilities for leaders today if they want to build psychological safety. And, these are fundamental. These are not things that, we can't comprehend. I think, why is it so hard for leaders just to do these four basics?
I think we often, and I'll put myself in this bucket, we get distracted or we're unaware of our impact. I think leaders are generally well intentioned, but the impact does not always match. And so you have to do the work to understand what impacts am I making and what data is showing me that. Is it feedback? Am I getting feedback? Are people quiet all the time? Quiet is not always good. I used to hear this saying, no news is good news, and I don't agree. Like, no news is no news. Like, tell me what's going on and help me understand. So I think sometimes it's really a lack of awareness that these skills really need to be built. But once you kind of understand the impact that a lack of psychological safety has, you become convicted to do something to build that capability and that skill set.
Right. I remember it reminds me of a leadership program that we did in partnership with the University of Georgia Exec Ed Center, I don't know, gosh, a decade ago for a very large international company. And the CEO came in and brought his top 180 through these. There were about 30 to 40 in each cohort coming in to this leadership program. And then the first inaugural kickoff program, we had done so much work working with the CEO, wanted to build this culture. He was launching innovation as a part of the core capability of the business. And he really wanted all the leaders to feel a part of it, right? To really bring their best, to challenge the future of the company, to bring their best thinking, all the things that you've talked about today, where there would be psychological safety. And the CEO that had come in, he had come in on an all-night flight internationally. He was exhausted. He got up and did the kickoff in the meeting, and he talked about their launch of their new innovation capability. And one gentleman raised his hand and he said, "This is really great. I'm happy to hear about it." And I don't know, something just clicked with the CEO. This was not his typical persona, right? Something just clicked with the CEO, and he goes, "You didn't know about it? Like, are you not reading my memos? Are you not reading my emails?" And so it just, I mean, that I know he spent months preparing for this opening remarks. And something just clicked at that moment where he was exhausted. He just kind of went off script and completely shut down all interaction with that group for the rest of the cohort.
Mm,
So I think sometimes we have to remember as leaders, we may have every intention, but we have to take care of ourselves. We have to nurture ourselves. We have to be rested so that we can be aware of our communication and our reactions and really be mindful about how we're engaging. I mean, I know that wasn't his intention and it was an unfortunate kickoff to a program, but I think we have to be balanced in our approach and make sure that we're nurturing ourselves as leaders, as well as using these tips and tools along the way so that we can bring our best selves to the table.
absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's keep going. What else for us today, Brandon, on psychological
Yes.
safety?
So really the final thing I wanted to cover was a framework I worked to put together, and it was really around an article I wrote back in 2022 about how to unlock high potential performance in anybody. And I was really looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then I was thinking about my personal experience and developing talent. So I came up with a little bit of a visual, and if you're listening, I'll explain it to you. But really, the base of this visual is action-oriented empathy. Oftentimes, you'll hear this banter about, is it empathy? Is it compassion? But really, empathy fosters the right type of environment where we see others and then we act upon what we understand in a way that has a really solid impact towards them. And then after that, they'll open up with you and they'll let you know, hey, I'm in the right seat. And here's why. I know why, and you know why. We both know why, and we can align the talent to the right opportunities or to the right seats. And once you have them in the right seats, you can then look at their expectations and then think about the individual goals, how they then level up to the team, how they then level up to the organizational outputs at large. And this clarity leads directly to success and the targets that we want to see and that we desire. And we know, Jenny, we know in this environment, we have to be agile and we have to continuously assess the landscapes. I put agility-based coaching on here to talk about having that flexibility to respond, because what we talk about in January could be drastically different in March or April or May. And then the final piece of this puzzle is the accountability system. If you don't have a system of accountability and a way to track and measure that, the rest of this model can fall apart. So this is a clear view performance model that helps and it connects to psychological safety and leading back up to that pinnacle. If you understand it's the most important factor to a high performing team, you're going to make sure you're doing everything possible to cultivate that type of environment.
Mhm. Yeah, I love it. Very, very fantastic model, Brandon. I love this foundation that you identified as action-oriented empathy. And that's where I think that really being including each other's perspective, having that aura of psychological safety and that empathy perspective coming into play as that foundation. Then as you develop those expectation and the accountability system, we can really be open and authentic with each other. We can help support each other when we're needing that help to address our accountabilities, or if we need more clarity on expectations, we feel open to ask for that, right? When we have all of that going on in the background to really support this clear view performance model. What tips do you have for leaders as they're looking at launching this type of holistic performance model? Anything that you would suggest for leaders as they're embracing something like this?
Yeah, before you show up in the arena, you have to practice. We don't just show up to the games and play. So it's a matter of understanding the importance and what psychological safety is and what it is not, and then being accountable in our roles as leaders to build those other dynamics up. And so I think just continue to learn, read the 4 stages of psychological safety, read the fearless organization, read teaming, read, the science of failing well. There's so many different resources that are at our disposal. And I'm happy to, provide any other, recommendations or suggestions, but I would just say practice. It's not easy. Give yourself grace. You're not going to be perfect, but don't stop at your intention. Follow through until you realize the impact that you want to see.
Right. Really great advice. Really great advice. Thank you so much, Brandon, for sharing with us today. It's been wonderful to get your perspective on psychological safety. And then I think you're all calling us to be better leaders generally as we look at bringing in psychological safety and all of these aspects of the clear view performance model to bear. The role of a leader is so critically important. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with it. And I think your challenge to us to grow and continue to challenge ourselves to be better each and every day by learning, reading, having a peer group that you can openly share with and get coaching from, all those aspects to be the very best leaders we can be every day. So
Yes.
thank you so much for this, a great presentation. It will be available on our blog, and we'll be sending out a recording of today's session with Brandon to those who weren't able to join us today. So you can catch that on Leaders in the Arena, our podcast series. Also, if you want to connect with Brandon, his LinkedIn is in the chat today. So I know that if you have questions for him directly, do follow Brandon Springle on linkedin.com, and I'm sure that he can give you some additional insights along the way. More sessions coming up in our Leaders in the Arena series. We have Colonel Pat Rayner and Dr. John Platings having some extraordinary conversation around leadership lessons from the military perspective. And then Carleen Blanding talking about deliberate calm. And then we have our Bright Spark Awards program coming up with our kids who've been working on housing in crisis situations, part of our Give Back and our Innovation for Good program, free competitions for kids, and our Bright Spark program awards coming up on that. We hope to see you again on another Leader in the Arena session really soon. Take care, everyone. Bye now.